Hey y'all, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Royce Brooks. I'm the Executive Director of Annie's List. I am incredibly excited for today's conversation, and I hope that y'all are as well. Started today with a bit of a positive experience with another um, right-minded Supreme Court decision affirming the essential nature of abortion access here all across the country. And that really is such a key value for Annie's List. For those of you who may not be as familiar with our work, I'd love to tell you a little bit about who we are, what we do, and why it's important. Over the last 17 years, Annie's List has elected more than 140 progressive women all across Texas, trained thousands more, and invested over $19 million to build women's political power. We know Texas from El Paso to Houston and from Dallas to the Valley. And we know firsthand that Texas is the biggest battleground state because at Annie's List, we've been doing the work to make it that way. And right now, we are only 9 seats away from flipping party control of the Texas House to Democratic control this November. Last cycle, Annie's List helped a historic number of women win their races across Texas, and I'm so proud to share that we had a record-breaking 84% win rate in 2018. That means 31 of the record 37 candidates we endorsed won their elections. In fact, 85% of all the women who ran for the Texas state legislature were Annie's List trainees. With that unprecedented track record, we led the Democratic Party in flipping 12 Texas House seats from red to blue in 2018. And this year, we're about to blow that record out of the water. We're going to elect more women than ever in our history. We're going to send a record number of women to the Texas Ledge. And fun fact, the Texas House has never elected a woman as Speaker. This cycle, we have the chance not only to flip the House to Democratic control, but to see a progressive woman elected Speaker for the first time in the history of our state. Now, y'all know we're living through an unprecedented moment of crisis on a global scale. There are those who warn us not to politicize this crisis, but the fact is that this crisis is a direct result of our politics, from the cruel, fear-driven leadership of the president to the years of irresponsible, short-sighted disinvestment in our communities under Texas Republican leadership. Because of politics, Texas has the largest uninsured population in the country during a global pandemic. Because of politics, families all over Texas are struggling through this moment without paid family or medical leave. Because of politics, Texans are being forced to choose between exercising their right to vote and their health and that of their children. But the solutions that will keep people safe are the same solutions our Annie's List champions stand for. Y'all, elections have consequences, and our work continues. To learn even more about our work, please visit us at annieslist.com. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today, and especially to our sponsors whose support makes what we do possible. We'd like to give a big thank you to today's sponsors: Tori Adams, Marion Brooks Bryant, Laurie Felker Jones, Sonia G., Heidi Gerbrocht, Tanya Hanway, Shelley Hayes McMahon, Laura Hernandez, Allison Makalik, and Yvonne Palayo. If you would like to support our work, please visit bit.ly/support AnniesListTX. and you'll find that link in your chat box. Now, I am so proud to introduce today's guest. She's a personal friend of mine. She described me as her comrade of close to 20 years, which is getting a little too close to revealing something about my age that I would rather keep concealed. But I just am so honored to have had the chance to watch her journey into leadership over the years that we have known each other. Amber Goodwin is the founding director of the Community Justice Action Fund, CJAF, and of the Community Justice Reform Coalition, CJRC. CJAF is the only national gun violence organization led by a woman of color and is led by a governing board made up of 100% gun violence survivors of color. They focus on alleviating gun violence in communities of color by educating stakeholders on ways to advocate for solutions that will reduce gun violence without targeting or further harming communities of color. They amplify the voices of people in disproportionately impacted communities and work to support new and existing leaders of the gun violence prevention movement. Prior to CJAF, Amber spent the last 18 years working for advocacy, grassroots, and electoral campaigns. She served as the first national advocacy director for Americans for Responsible Solutions, now Giffords. She helped found the Women's Coalition for Common Sense, a multi-sector group of national women leaders who joined forces to reduce gun violence, and leads the National Gun Violence Prevention Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. She served on the board of Operation Lipstick, a community-based organization that uses peer-to-peer education and leadership development models to inform women and girls about the dangers of buying, hiding, and holding guns illegally, showcase positive role models, and change high-risk behaviors. She served as National Deputy Director for Government Affairs at Enroll America, the nation's leading healthcare organization that enrolled over 20 million consumers into the Affordable Care Act. She's held several political positions and appointments at the Wendy Davis for Governor campaign, SEIU Justice for Janitors campaign, Obama for America, the Texas State Legislature, Grassroots Solutions Consulting Firm, and Mobilize.org. Amber has received national recognition for her leadership. She was named to the 2018 Essence Magazine Woke 100, the 2017 Root 100 list of the most influential African Americans, and has been profiled in Forbes, Cosmo, The Griot, and Newsweek. Amber, I'm so pleased.
I'm like, oh, hi, how are you?
Hey.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. We usually do this not in front of a crowd of people, and there's often wine involved.
There is wine and dogs, but yes, I'm very excited to be here today.
Today we will keep it straightforward. And in the first place, I would love to have you tell us a little bit about your background, how you became activated in this work, and tell us about CJAF and how you founded it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you mentioned this before I came on, but the most recent kind of accolade that I'm the proudest of is being a board member of Annie's List. And so I just want to start off by thanking you and your team for all the incredible work that you're doing. It's hard right now to get people to focus on so many different things. And we just know how important it is to support women, and especially in this election cycle in our state. And so just thank you for everything that you all are doing. It's important. It's gonna save lives, because I truly fundamentally believe we're gonna elect people this year that are supportive of changing the conditions that so many of our people have been in that have been harmful to them. And so just thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you all are doing. But so I really started off wanting to be a high-powered attorney because that's what everyone told me I should be whenever I grew up. I think it's because I argued with people, which is not going to be shocking to anybody who knows me who's on here, but I used to like to argue, people still do. And I spent most of my college career really starting to think about how I could go into law school. I did not get into any law schools when I first applied, and that was almost 20 years ago. And so I did the next natural thing for people of a certain age, and I became a struggling Hill staffer on Capitol Hill. And so I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and I was like, I cannot believe that I really thought that I was like a struggling staffer because I worked at a restaurant and I worked at a call center just to be able to make ends meet. So people always talk about that with like LA and starving artists, and we have those in DC as well. But I started working on the Hill, and that's where I know, Royce, you and I got to meet, and we were one of, or I guess two of, along with Jane Hamilton, the only Black female staffers in Congress, which was just wild that that was 20 years ago and not 100 years ago. And so I learned very quickly that Congress was fantastic for networking, but it wasn't for me. I knew that there was something else that was out there outside of kind of just passing legislation, which is so important and so critical. But I really got the campaign bug very quickly. I worked on a campaign in New Jersey. And then I thought about, you know, these campaigns are great, but it seems like we're not changing these conditions that a lot of people who look like me and look like you have to deal with every single day. So I came back to DC after working on campaigns, and I learned about the Justice for Janitors movement with SEIU. And so I came home to Houston and worked on the Justice for Janitors campaign. And so we were fighting for low-wage workers across Houston who were trying to get a raise. And by a raise, I mean not $20 an hour. They were fighting to make $7.15 an hour. And so I did that for a couple of years, got myself arrested, which is, again, still one of my proudest moments in history, of my history. And then, you know,
behest of John Lewis.
At the behest of John Lewis, yes, who told us that's the least we could do, which was pretty exciting to even be in his presence. But, you know, I spent years working for the Obama campaign, doing different things. And about 5 years ago, actually, Royce, right after we got off of Wendy Davis's campaign, I was sitting on a beach because I had no idea what I wanted to do. I thought I was old because I had just turned, I was in my early 30s, and which that's a whole nother story because I wasn't. And I decided that I had a friend call me and say, Gabby Giffords is looking for somebody who has almost the exact same kind of background. They wanted somebody who knew about national politics, but also was really committed to local work as well. And I know that she's been a big supporter of Annie's List and the work of just women across the country. And so I was really enthusiastic to go work for her. And then about a year into working for her, I just had this moment, and the moment happened, I know the exact time, it was June 15th of 2015. And that was the day that the Charleston shooting happened. And I will never forget just hearing people, policymakers saying, oh my gosh, this shooting reminds me of what happened in Tucson, or this reminds me of all these other kind of mass shootings we had heard about, primarily with white people. And I thought all these people look like my grandmothers and my cousins, and they look like me. And I really started to think about how policies could change if there were people who looked like the people who are directly impacted by them. And so really started thinking about how we could change things. And so there were no organizations at the time who were led by people of color. And so started this organization kind of thinking I'd do it for maybe a year or so. And we just celebrated our 4-year anniversary, and really trying to build power, but also make sure that we're empowering people who are closest to the pain of gun violence every single day. And so we work in all 50 states, but have a very special connection here to the work in Texas.
That is a fantastic story and a fantastic transition into our first audience question. We have Sarah today. Sarah, are you with us?
I am. Hi, everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us. What is your question for Amber?
Thank you so much for hosting this. I've heard such wonderful things about both of you, so it's really great to be a part of this. My daughter is here. She may jump in and add some questions, a question of her own or nuance. But My question was, thinking about actions and practices, and my question is, what actions and practices have you seen within nonprofit organizations or movements as having the greatest real impact on equity and inclusion?
Oh, Amber, you seem to have become muted.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, we can.
Great. Sarah, thank you so much for the question. And I hope that your daughter gets to ask a question too, because that would be great. In my personal experience, I've seen a lot of great movements. One that I will just really shout out that we've seen recent successes with, outside of, there's been great movement in the gun violence prevention movement, especially with people of color, but I got to shout out the Dreamers, because the people who have been directly impacted are brothers and sisters, some immigrants, some undocumented from all over the country, not just Texas. The people who are directly impacted by the issue of this failed immigration, in my opinion, failed immigration system across the country and in places like Texas, have been fighting for so long before many of them even had the right to fight. Many of them putting not only their bodies on the line by getting arrested or doing actions, but I think what was so incredible about the ongoing organizing around organizations like United We Dream, is that they were really led by the people who were going to be directly impacted by the issue. And so it was incredibly important. It didn't happen overnight. A lot of the decisions that we're seeing today and a couple weeks ago with DACA were very skilled, that had to do with a lot of direct actions that happened in cities and in states across the country for many years. There have been lots of legislation that has happened on the federal, state, and local level. But what I always just come back to is how incredible the people are who are willing to risk everything to make sure that people were treated equally in this country. And so I definitely think the Dreamers and a lot of those organizations have done an incredible job.
And Amber, I'd love to have you connect that idea with CJAF and the gun violence movement, and thinking about having a movement led by the people who are impacted, rather than have it be a law enforcement problem or a gun control problem. How do you envision that movement and the challenge?
Yeah, I envision, and I've said this for the last at least 4 years, but that another world that is possible, that, and it's not even possible, it's probable, and we're on the precipice of seeing it. For so long in this country, we have been told that the only way to keep our communities safe is by adding more and more, not only law enforcement, but adding provisions that just materially change how people and generations of people have been seen in society. The issue of gun violence cannot only be legislated about hardware. And what we've seen for so long, I would say for the last 20 years, is very much a focus on two things. One, who has access to the gun? So are we closing loopholes to make sure that people can't have access to the gun because of whatever is on a list? Or two, thinking about what type of hardware, right? And so are we gonna ban assault weapons ban? And for people who are directly impacted and traumatized by gun violence every single day, those are two important parts, but there are so many different other parts of the issue of gun violence and how it traumatizes people every single day. And the people who are directly impacted, but I'll just say very quickly some statistics that I think I didn't know before I joined the gun violence prevention movement. We hear these numbers, how there are 40,000 people a year who die by gun violence. But when you really dig into the data, the disproportionate impact are the people who are directly impacted by the issue. So it's Pride Month, and I know everybody kind of now is talking about trans women of color and trans Black women and Marsha P. Johnson and so many other incredible people, and how Pride was started with a riot, but there are still Black trans people dying at the hands of law enforcement that don't have any sort of recourse, and their names aren't being said. And so we really think about who's the most marginalized person that we know. We make sure that they not only have a seat at the table, but are helping to create the tables. And so as you think about the issue of gun violence, the impact is very high on communities of color disproportionately. And then a lot of these issues that we don't talk about with gun violence, especially in communities of color, including the high rate of suicides. Suicides are actually 2/3 of the gun deaths. Out of that 40,000 people that I said a year, 2/3 of those people die by suicide. So that means that there's a large number of people of color, but just people in general and in Texas that are dying by suicide. And so what we've seen is just making sure that we're thinking about how these laws that we're passing are going to impact people that are marginalized. And one quick example that I'll just give is there was a bill last year, a background checks bill that was going through Congress, the 2019 background checks bill. And this is connecting it back to immigration. It was a clean bill. It looked great. Members of Congress were supporting it. And one of the things that was added onto the bill was something around ICE. And so we knew that ICE, having something that was anti-immigration was not something that we wanted to support. And so we had to make sure that we got a different type of clean bill whenever it went to the Senate. And so there's a lot of intersections, I think, on the issue of gun violence and crime. And so we really make sure that those folks are at the table with us as well.
Thank you. We have an additional question. Marion, are you with us?
I am.
Wonderful. Y'all, this is my Aunt May. Aunt May, what is your question for Amber?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask this question. Does your advocacy for gun violence intersect with police violence and police brutality reform?
Looks like Amber is muted.
I am sorry. Every time I keep muting myself, and so I am really sorry about that. I may thank you so much for that question. And I think it's not only timely, but critical and important. I'll say, I guess, 3 things that I've tried to get people to kind of think about when talking about police violence and gun violence is that there's no way to really separate the two. And I think that in this country for a long time, we've said, gun violence is over here. So it's either mass shootings and what's happening in Chicago, or it's, something else that's happening maybe in like the Midwest. But police violence, and we've seen it so often play out, especially in the last couple of years, can be considered gun violence. When the media would talk about police shootings, even when people like Philando Castile, that were coming up on the anniversary of his murder in Minnesota. When he was killed, people weren't really saying, oh, this is police violence, is gun violence. They were just saying, this is an unfortunate thing that happened. It keeps happening in America, and it was caught on film. And so we've seen the high rates, especially of people of color in this country who are dying at the hands of police. And it's disproportionately, I don't know the exact numbers because the data that is kept either by police departments or health departments isn't exactly clear on how many deaths there are. But when we're talking about just the impact and who is impacted by police violence, there's a clear distinction that people of color, especially Black people, die at higher rates. And also are, we talk a lot about not only in police violence, but also domestic violence, about lethality. But there are other ways that people are impacted by police violence and gun violence as well, including things like coercion. And when I think about Philando Castile, I think about his girlfriend and his baby who were sitting in the back seat, who's witnessed the entire thing and will be traumatized for the rest of their lives, and the people who witnessed George Floyd's murder as well. And so a lot of what we're trying to do now as advocates is really think about, if we're going to say don't fund police, and I think we'll probably get to the question on defunding and what does that actually look like and what does it mean. What we're asking for as advocates is to make sure that we're telling people what we do want to fund whenever it comes to gun violence. So as advocates, for us, that looks like creating systems of safety and healthy and thriving communities. It means fully funding evidence-based research and evidence-based solutions to dramatically reduce gun violence that we've seen across the country. And it means people thinking about policy in a way, in a framework that doesn't just focus on the hardware of gun violence, but it focuses on the totality of the challenge, because gun violence in communities of color and in Black communities manifests different. I'm still reeling from incidents of violence that I never witnessed, that I'm sure my mom witnessed. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking through from a policy perspective, how can we make sure that we have a trauma-informed policy response whenever it comes to gun violence. And a lot of that has to do with actually funding programs that are led by the community.
Thank you for that. And, you know, you mentioned George Floyd and you mentioned the defund the police movement that really has taken wing in the wake of his death. Let's get into it. You know, some people hear defund the police and they think, no, I don't want to do that. That, you know, scares them off maybe from a movement that before they heard that language or that approach, maybe they were starting to feel attracted to. What does defund the police mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean to you? How do you go about sort of thinking through that movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think I went through probably the same set of, it wasn't even emotions, but I think a transition over the last 2 months. I think, and somebody just wrote defund as a confusing term. And you know, I think for many of us who have essentially been asking for defunding or divesting, what we really mean is to invest in communities. Looking up the definition of defunding, and I know there's been a lot of memes on social media about everybody knew what defunding meant whenever it talked about Planned Parenthood or other social services that have been cut. Whenever we're talking about our schools, especially here in Texas, everybody has been very, very clear on what defunding means. And so to me, defunding means funding services for communities to be healthy, but also finding alternatives that don't involve incarceration and don't involve law enforcement as the only answer. And so I think for a lot of people, that means incremental change. For some people, it means change tomorrow. But for us on gun violence, I'll give you an example. In Minnesota, there's a lot of Black and brown people who work on gun violence prevention right now, who work with law enforcement to help identify who are the people who are actually going out and doing shootings. So it's an important tactic for them, but it's not an important tactic for a lot of other people. And so I think that there was almost like a shock to people of using the word defund, but if you look it up, Webster's dictionary or any other kind of like any online service, it's going to tell you that it means to essentially stop funding what isn't working. It doesn't mean stop funding an entity or stop funding a program. And so it's happened before, which doesn't mean that it obviously was not right when they were defunding Planned Parenthood and other services like that. But what I would just ask people, because I think there was a visceral reaction to the word in law enforcement because people hadn't imagined kind of what the possibilities were. I will be very transparent. I had never said defund the police before. I had never thought about it before probably a month and a half ago. And I've been doing my research and I've been trying to understand. And I also have been understanding for a long time about if I'm saying defund the police or if I'm saying divest in police, then I need to have, for me as an organization and for us as an organization, have an idea of what we're telling people to fund instead. And I think AOC and some other people have had some really, really good just commentary on that when the people have asked, what does defunding police look like? And I know for me, it looks like, and she said an iteration of this, it looks like how I grew up, because I didn't grow up with cops in my neighborhood. I didn't grow up with barred fences anywhere. I grew up in the suburbs of Midland, Texas, right? So I didn't have anything. I had what I needed. If schools were never cut, I always had health insurance. I always had access to care. And so I would just ask folks, and I've had to do this myself, is just to take a second and think about probably the most marginalized person, like close your eyes if you have to, and think about the most marginalized person that you know and that you care about and you love, but they are marginalized in society, and think about what they need. And I almost can guarantee you, no matter where you come from, that the first 5 things are not going to be law enforcement, or they're not going to be like heavy amounts of police. I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of educating people on what are their alternatives. You know, I was talking to my parents and they were like, well, if I'm not calling 911 or the police, if somebody breaks in, who am I supposed to call? Right. And so I think a lot of us are having those conversations right now, but I would just ask us to think through, like, if we are how are we actually imagining, and not even only reimagining, but imagining a place that we've been told doesn't exist. And I believe that it does exist, where communities are more in control of essential services and different aspects of our everyday life.
No, I think that that really makes sense. And one of the ways that that I have been thinking about it is, you know, if you, I'm going to start speaking in cliches. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Mhm.
If the most well-funded government agency is your law enforcement agency, then
Mhm.
all of your problems are going to start to look like law enforcement problems,
Right.
right? We are living in a space where in all of our major counties, the largest mental health care provider is the county jail, right? That's that is making the law enforcement system a hammer attacking a nail that doesn't quite fit, to just
Mhm.
mangle a metaphor altogether, right? And
Right.
what would it look like if instead of people dealing with mental health issues being a police problem, we were robustly funding mental health services, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that is just sort of one example of the type of way in which um, we can start to rethink what it means to have a better balance and more of a set of priorities around these issues.
Yeah.
You know, in sort of the um, governmental policy space, um, folks say, you know, show me your budget and
Mhm.
I'll show you what you care about, right?
Right.
And so many of our budgets um, clearly prioritize policing and law enforcement above any other social service that might be just as crucially important for folks.
Yeah. And I will also say every year the issue of gun violence costs America, and this is not a lot of indirect costs, but around $229 billion a year. And there is not a set federal group of funding, or I know in the state of Texas, cities, states, and statewide don't have a set of funding for preventing gun violence. So to me, if this issue is so incredibly, the issue of gun violence in Texas is so important and so critical, we need to be funding solutions that work. And a lot of the solutions that we work on, but also our partners across Texas and across the country work on, are not only based in evidence, but also have been shown to dramatically reduce incidents of violence and also give communities or hospital systems or healers the control into how to solve a lot of these problems. And I will say that that you know the one piece that I really want to uplift is because we've been hearing it so much in the news, and I don't think I'm jumping ahead to anyone's question, hopefully, but when we started COVID, we heard so much about so many people buying guns, and then we heard about so many people having incidents of domestic violence. And one of the things that we continue to hear from women of color, women who are low-income women of color, was that they were actually scared to call law enforcement because they were scared about either their partner being arrested or dual arrest. And so I also imagine a world where there's somewhere else that they can call that helps intervene in situations where there is a gun present in a home. And so there's a lot of ways to rethink this as in terms of what is our natural response or what we've been told versus what are the ways that we can think about the services that are out there.
Great.
Great.
So we have a couple of folks chatting in with some questions, and
Okay.
I'd love to address some of these. So we have from Tori Adams, Tarrant County's primary runoff ballots contain one nonpartisan issue. And Tori, thank you for this question, because you are prompting me to note for everybody on the chat today that today marks the first day of early voting for the July 14th primary runoffs and special elections. So please if you don't already have your plan to vote, make a plan, go vote. Elections have never been so important. Thank you, Tori. So the one nonpartisan issue on Tarrant County's ballots is the refunding of the county crime prevention district. Amber, do you have any comment on supporting or opposing this issue? Tori says, it's my understanding that if rejected, the funds in the CCPD will go away versus being able to be redistributed, and that she works with several vital agencies that do receive funding from the CCPD.
I'm not, hey Tori, by the way, it's good to, I almost said good to see you, but it's good to see your name. I am actually not sure. I will do some digging. I will actually look that up and see. I don't know if that's a law enforcement controlled part of the county, but I'm assuming that it probably is. I will do some research and find out. I'm just not familiar enough with how the government agency is set up. I know that I don't know if all the essential services will go away, so I will find out and just get a definitive answer on how the crime district is actually put together and get an answer back to you though.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Jessica as well. She says, thank you for unpacking defund the police. She says, I so hope our imaginations are up to the task for going forward into new spaces for social services and care. Any ideas how to help or how to heal our imaginations so that we can do this?
Yeah, I mean, I used to not be a fan of social media for anything, but I actually think in the age of coronavirus and COVID-19, it's essential. And I really had to stretch not my imagination, but what I'm not scared to talk publicly about, and also what I'm not scared to say that I don't know. I didn't know a trans person of color until about 8 years ago. That doesn't mean that I didn't care about trans people of color. It meant that I was not in proximity because of my group of friends that I had chosen to somebody who was a trans person of color. And now that I think about that, and I, again, keep coming back to Pride Month, I think of, especially with the people protesting right now and the people who are changing, and I keep saying this, but the conditions in this country that are not working for so many people who look like me and Royce have to be changed. We absolutely have to have systemic change that starts now. And it's not easy to think about that because, again, if someone breaks into my parents' house today, right now, I'm going to tell them to call 911 because in Jacksonville, Florida, I don't know who else they're supposed to call. I am scared because my dad is a Black man if they call 911 of what's going to happen at the same time. And so I think a lot of these truths can be, we can hold all of these truths at the same time about maybe we don't know all the answers, but I would say there's a lot of really brilliant, and I'll make sure that I get this over to Shelley and Royce and everybody. There's a lot of really brilliant people who are talking about how do we dig deeper in how we're thinking about what, not only what we can imagine, but also what people have been fighting for a long time. And I think of, again, with Pride, that not only was it started by a riot, but it was started by people who had everything to lose and had nothing, right? I have a house, you know, I have a car, I have 2 dogs that you'll probably hear barking, I have a family unit and everything, but the people who are out there risking everything so we can actually have this conversation are the people who have everything to lose. If they go to jail, they cannot get out. There's still people in jail from Ferguson, right? Like it is wild, but there are still people in jail since Ferguson that were out there protesting, right? So I think that as we think about, like, maybe one thing I would just say that I would have never said before is to follow some people on Instagram that are really thinking through the nuances of how we have this conversation, but also thinking about how are we being very solutions based, because if we just complain about stuff is very challenging, but if we think about solutions, it makes it a lot easier. So when we're reimagining things, I think about the people that I know, but also how to fight for the people that I don't know, because I think that's even more important.
Amber, I think that that is so true. And you mentioned Ferguson, which I know because I was with you and saw this happening.
Mhm.
Was such a life-changing moment for you in terms of the trajectory of your work in this space. Um, CJAF is the only national gun violence prevention group led by a Black woman.
Mhm.
Why is that?
Let me find my words. Um, One, I think it's, you know this from being a Black woman who is leading or very successfully leading an organization. Um, people don't trust Black women's leadership. And it is not only apparent, but it is documented. It is a fact. It is no longer conjecture from Black women that people are treating us poorly. We know this as a fact. And so I would say that I have and am very public that I possess a lot of unearned privilege that I use to my advantage to be able to start this organization. So I didn't have a salary for 6 months because really nobody wanted to fund a Black girl talking about police violence and gun violence and trans people of color and all these different things. And I fundamentally, and last year I spoke in front of Congress, and one of the first things that I said was, shame on you all for just now having the first time that a Black woman is in front of Congress in the history of Congress talking about this issue.
And
But
I was
also
at that hearing and I clapped when you said
but what I also told them is that I know that another world, I've always believed that another world was possible. And I really think that's because, and not to get like too sentimental or emotional, but like you've talked about your family and everything that they gave up to pave the way for so many people, not just in Fort Worth, but across the state of Texas, and I'm sure the country. But people gave up everything, right? Our ancestors gave up everything to be able to get us to a place where I can emphatically say to a mayor of a city in Texas, actually, no, we're not going to fund that. And we are going to fund Black women's leadership for a new way to think about domestic violence, right? And we are also in different positions of power that have really been able to stretch the imagination, I think, of how people think of Black women's leadership. And we're not just being put in leadership positions because of we're Black or because we're women, but it's because we're qualified, right? And I think of even when last year after the shooting in El Paso, the city of Austin put together a gun violence task force, and the mayor asked me to be his appointee. And the first thing I was thinking is, he's probably just doing it because, I'm Black or whatever. And, his staff called me and they said, no, you're the best person for this position, right? And which I'm very grateful for. But I think, it has been hard, but I think that there are just so many more Black women who are out there whose leadership hasn't been trusted, that we need to make sure that we're lifting each other up as well as we go along. So I wish that there were 15 other Black women who are running gun violence prevention organizations. So if anybody is on here today who wants to work on gun violence, definitely please let me know.
I knew that our mayor had some sense, picking the right woman for the job. And obviously there's still so much work to be done in the gun violence prevention space. And it requires both the people in our communities and the people we've elected to represent our communities in order to make that difference. And with that in mind, we have a question from Jill Switzer, the executive director of Texas Gun Sense, that touches more on that. Jill asks, what are specific recommendations for the Texas legislature to address race and gun violence?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Jill, and for all the work that you do. And Jill has always made sure that we as an organization and that I'm included in the work that she does. So I really appreciate that. We're coming up with a slate of policy priorities for 2021, and I'm really thinking through what can people even do in this interim session. I'll say 3 of them. One is create a statewide Office of Violence Prevention that's led by the community, but that, you know, when there's a health department or different departments across the country, they give a lot of either priority funding or give a lot of support when there's an actual codified part in the law, part of a system of governing. And so we strongly believe in California and New Jersey and New York and a couple of other states, there have been offices of violence prevention that have been led by the community and are statutory, and they are funded by the state, and they help support community-based organizations all over the state. And so in places like California, they started off with a budget of about $2 million. $2 million for the state of California is abysmal, but now it's up to over 30 million, right? And so we don't even have to imagine what's possible there. We can actually see it, right? And they've had dramatic reductions, not only in homicide, but I would say the second thing is also making sure that we're having survivor-led support for issues of domestic violence. So domestic violence and guns is an intersection that is deadly. If there is a gun in a home, a woman, it's usually a woman just because that's the only data that we have, but in those types of partnerships, a woman is 500 times more likely to die if there is a gun present in the home. So that doesn't mean that, like, if someone's thinking about a gun, but just the mere presence of a gun makes it 500 times more likely that that woman is going to die. And so right now, a lot of the challenges on a local level is that the removal processes involve police or they involve law enforcement in a way that, again, leads to dual arrest or leads to circumstances that harm the community. And so what we're trying to figure out is how do we make sure that those essential services that counties and cities really fund right now get the funds that they need, right? The Houston Area Women's Center, all these different organizations that have been doing incredible work, but don't have the capacity, whether it's shelters, National Domestic Violence Hotline. And so we really want to have a focus on gender-based violence, specifically for women of color. There's been a lot of conversation about closing loopholes, like the boyfriend loophole, about who's able to be, you know, the person who is or is not your intimate partner, and different things like that, that are very small incremental changes that people have been trying to make for a long time. And what we're going to be demanding is that they're not small and incremental changes, because as many of you here know, we're paying for violence and death one way or another, right? So either we pay the $229 billion up front and give essential services to community-based organizations that we know are doing incredible evidence-based work that has the efficacy to say that it works, or we pay $229 billion when people die or when women are killed. And so one is getting a statewide Office of Violence Prevention. Another is really thinking through survivor-led domestic violence work. And then we really, I think, especially in the state of Texas, with the high rates of suicide, are really trying to figure out how do we make sure that we're doing more work on suicide prevention. And a lot of that does start with innovation on research, because we just don't know enough about the issue of suicide and guns. We know that it's prevalent, but I think we need a little bit more time and work. So we do think that the legislature can play a role on all three of those issues.
Fantastic. And, you know, at Annie's List, domestic violence is one of the key value pillars that we fight on. And so, again, I will lift up the fact that there is an election happening literally right now today. And there are 6 Annie's List candidates on the ballot. Akila Basie, Lorraine Birabal, Xochitl Peña Rodriguez, Krista Castañeda, Sarah Stapleton Barrera, and Sarah Eckhart. So y'all please make your voting plan, go out and support these women. Electing folks who share our values is exactly how we get to the policy outcomes that Amber is describing. And now really just one last question for you. And we had a conversation around this question during our last virtual conversation with Valerie Jarrett last month, but I would love to hear you on this topic as well, which is, what do you say to the young people who are just trying to navigate their daily life with a target on their back?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first thing that I say, and I get like very emotional talking about this, is I would just thank young people. I think people think of young people, and Royce, since we're not young anymore, we can say that we are not in this category, but
Yourself, I am 2 weeks younger than
yeah, Royce is 2 weeks younger, and we're not really 40. We skipped this year. But I would say, I think a lot about how my life would have changed. And I don't agree with everything that AOC does, right? But just the dynamic of having a young woman of color who is so sure about not only what her generation needs, but what generations and generations after her are going to need, would have actually changed my entire life. And so I think some things that we can do, people like us who are maybe, let's just say, young adjacent, people like us can do to help out. Sometimes is to move out of the way, because there are young people who are actually leading efforts across the state of Texas and across this country who are 25, who are 28, who are 30, who don't get the support they need, because there are people who are a little bit older or much older who are taking up a lot of space and have a lot of platforms. And so I think as much as possible, creating not just mentorship opportunities, but opportunities for people to really be able to utilize the platforms that have benefited a lot of us. I would say second, make sure that folks know that they shouldn't be afraid to ask for what they want. I think I was for a very long time in my career. And so I think that something like that, knowing that they need to ask for what they want and be told no. I always say now that especially since working on gun violence prevention, that I am much more proud of every time I have said no to a project or said no even to a funder, which my finance people can't stand. But I've said no to a funder because it just doesn't align with the values that we have as an organization. And so I think that people understanding what their purpose is, and also understanding truly what it means to have a vision for a life that's better, not only for you, but for the people who are around you. And also thinking about, we don't have to be in proximity to someone who's suffering to actually understand why we need to take action. And I think that's something that young people have really been able to show. Like, there were people out in the streets in Iowa because of George Floyd. He was from Houston, right? I had never seen anything like that before. And it's happened before. It happened with Ferguson. It happened with Standing Rock. It happened with all these different things that we have seen. But I would just implore young people to continue to not make concessions, but to continue fighting for people who don't feel like they have a voice. And I think that's incredibly important. And for more young people, and don't take offense to this, anybody who is a lawyer who's watching, because I'm in law school now, but we need more people who aren't just lawyers, like people who are nurses and are doctors and are teachers, and we need everybody to run for office. And so I am incredibly proud of everything that Annie's List has done, because it is just such a diversity of not only thought, but the vision has been clear, and also what we're asking for a different Texas has always been clear. And so I think that just making sure that people are thinking about, an elected official doesn't look like someone who went straight through college to, business school to such and such. And I want more radical people running for office. And so I'm really excited also, and I'm really proud to know a lot of the folks who are running and are in runoffs. And so I'll definitely be, Royce knows this, I will have 10 masks on, 14 sets of gloves, maybe a hazmat suit, but I will be going out and voting, which I'm really just excited about, and excited about the candidates who are on the ballot.
Amber, beautifully said. Thank you so much for doing this with us today. I have really had fun and learned so much, and I hope that our audience did as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And y'all, one last bit of information. Our next conversation in this summer series will feature Jennifer Palmieri. Jennifer is a best-selling author, the former communications director for Hillary Clinton, and honorary Annie's List fam. For more information about Annie's List, please visit annieslist.com or follow us at Annie's List TX across all social media platforms. And before we sign off permanently, I would also like to say hey to my dad, who also joined us today. Thank you, Commissioner Brooks, for being part of the conversation as well. Y'all have a great day. Thank you so much for being with us. Bye.